Welcome to Robson Radio. This is the official podcast of the University of Manitoba's Faculty of Law. This podcast is recorded on the original lands of the Anishinaabeg, Ininewok, Anishinaabe, Dakota Oyate, and on the national homeland of the Red River Métis. This podcast comes to you from the MLT Aikens classroom and was created using equipment kindly sponsored by MLT Aikens. The goal of Robson Radio is to tell the story of Western Canada's oldest law school. Each episode features an interview with one of our professors, directors, staff, students, or alumni, all of whom make our law school an exciting, relevant, and innovative and transformational place to be.
We need to be mindful of our humanity at a time when we're seeing the rise of conflict globally, but also conflict in our community, to always remember that every person has a story. Every person comes from a parent, and that everybody has somebody who knows them, and probably most people have at least one person that loves them unconditionally.
Welcome back to the student edition of Robson Radio, and thank you for joining us. I'm Austin.
And I'm Tessia.
Today's episode looks at a question that sits right at the intersection of criminal law, public health, and human rights. When does care become confinement?
In November 2025, Manitoba passed Bill 48, the Protective Detention and Care of Intoxicated Persons Act. It allows individuals who are highly intoxicated to be detained for up to 72 hours, even if they haven't committed a crime.
For listeners thinking about this through a legal lens, this raises immediate charter concerns, including the following. Section 7, life, liberty, security of the person. Section 9, arbitrary detention. Section 10b, access to counsel.
But beyond the legal doctrine, we wanted to understand how this actually plays out on the ground, in the communities most affected.
Our guest today is Leah Gazan, a longtime human rights advocate and member of parliament for Winnipeg Centre, the riding where this facility is located.
MP Gazan, thank you so much for being here.
Yes, thank you. And I'm glad that you're focusing on this. I know that some law students put a submission in on this.
So MP Gazan, can you tell us what you're seeing on the ground in your riding? For instance, what does the addictions and mental health crisis look like for the people you represent?
Well, I mean, certainly since the pandemic, we know that we're in a growing mental health crisis. We have seen massive divestment in affordable social housing unit. We know that certainly rates of poverty have gone up, rates of first-time houselessness have gone up. We are in, I would say, a mental health crisis, which is often, people often use substances, for example, to deal with mental health issues. We have a lack of mental health supports. We have unprecedented amounts of money spent on policing. But the problem is you can't police mental health and addictions away. This is not something you can arrest your way out. This is not a crisis that you can incarcerate your way out. We need a public health response. We are not seeing funding on the ground to truly respond to the crisis with a public health response. And as a result, it's a crisis.
You've been clear that this is a real crisis and that the intentions behind Bill 48 aren't necessarily bad. So at what point did the response start to feel like it was going in the wrong direction?
Well, I think it's important that I don't think people are making decisions with bad intentions. People are trying to figure out the best way to deal with the crisis. But here's the thing. What I've noticed as a legislator in this country is that we are seeing a trend of passing legislations and laws that do not uphold our Constitution or Charter. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. Bill C-12. That's a current piece of legislation in the House that violates the rights of migrants and asylum seekers and international conventions we've signed on to. Bill C-5, federally, that's another example of a law that was fast-tracked at an unprecedented rate through the House of Commons that waters down environmental laws, but also fails to uphold human rights law, including the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, something that was affirmed to have application in Canadian law in the last Parliament with the passing of Bill C-50 that affirmed the application of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in Canadian law. And Bill 48 that has a number of concerns. First of all, it's forced detention without access to legal aid or a lawyer for 72 hours. If you look at the committee meetings and the testimony that was shared, people aren't worried if somebody's going to die. They're worried about how soon it's going to happen. So it also has a lot of public safety issues to it. I don't think it would pass a charter challenge. And really, what are we doing here? They're looking at putting in place 4 beds for people who are supposedly on methamphetamines. Here's the difficulty with that. The former chief psychiatrist for the province of Manitoba said it's difficult to ascertain whether the behavior is a result of psychosis, schizophrenia, bipolar. And on top of that, it's hard to test the amount of meth that's in the system. You could have traces of meth, but you can't necessarily ascertain whether that's the cause of the behavior. The other problem is the people that are assessing the person that would be picked up and put into this 72-hour detention. Something that Senator Kim Pate likened to a solitary confinement unit. Police are not trained to do proper psychiatric assessments, to make the assessment when somebody is picked up. And although, they are saying that there will be a psychiatric assessment, which is required even under the Mental Health Act, there is no psychiatrist that is going to be situated at the location to make that psychiatric assessment. So that's very concerning to me. The other thing is it puts a tremendous strain on paramedics who are going to be the primary people responsible to look after acute health care needs. If you also look at the cells, if you look at the former, it was nicknamed the drunk tank. It was an empty solitary confinement unit with kind of there was a grate on the floor where people could defecate if needed. In these particular solitary confinement units, there's a sink with a toilet raised, metal, without beds. I think they're going to throw in a mat. I know at the time when I last was researching, they were looking at blankets that were safe for people that were having issues with mental health. My concern is you have people who are intoxicated, whether alcohol or on narcotics, in these cells. What if they fall and they bump their head? Mm-hmm. So I'm not necessarily convinced that the design of the unit, now I'm not an expert, I want to be really clear, I'm not an expert, but I'm not convinced that that design is a safe design for somebody who's intoxicated or on narcotics. I'm not sure that it's safe just looking at it. We know that when you're on substances, you might get dizzy, you might trip, you might have trouble keeping your balance. I'm curious about the design of the solitary confinement unit.
That's really helpful context. I want to take a second and turn to the facility itself. I understand that Senator Kim Pate visited your riding and you both tried to access the site. Were you able to tour the facility?
Well, no, it did not happen. I hope to tour it. I do have a legal right to tour as a member of Parliament. So I will exercise that right. I have to make sure that my constituents, I have to make sure that their constitutional rights are being held, that their charter rights are being protected. I think that's really important because as legislators, we are obliged to uphold the rule of law, and that's the Constitution. We can't be picking and choosing when to uphold rights, our Constitution, which includes the Charter. What's deeply troubling is that this seems to be becoming the new norm. Mm-hmm. And it's impacting the people that are most marginalized, whether it's people in encampments, whether it's people with mental health issues, whether it's people with housing issues. A failure to uphold those rights is deeply troubling, especially when we see all levels of government passing laws that are not consistent with the Constitution. It's a slippery slope, and it's a slippery slope I'm very concerned that all levels of government are going down. I also requested an access to information to find out more about the building. One of the concerns that was raised in the construction of the building, for example, was when you go into detentions or places where people are incarcerated, particularly in places of solitary confinement, people are locked in for a certain amount of hours per day. They're only let out for I think an hour a day. And very often they have these bars that go across that lock people in. What if there's a fire? Mm-hmm. One of the things that I found out is that the bars initially that were locking these units could not be opened through a main panel should there be a case of a fire. That's also a safety concern. That's a safety risk in terms of making sure that even the units are safe. We need to be mindful. I understand that people want quick fixes to things that are becoming a greater crisis. There are ways to fix this, and I'm going to go back. We need a public health response. We need to listen to experts. We need to make sure that we're not spending millions of dollars on revolving doors. I believe this cost $8 million. If you can only house, for example, 4 people on meth in it, let's say you do like this solution, that's not even a drop in the bucket. We're not even going to notice a difference on the streets. So why is there this rush? Why are we not taking a public health response? Why are we not taking an aggressive public health response to deal with this crisis? It doesn't make sense to me. As somebody who actually lives in the riding, who actually lives in the eye of the storm, I know it's not going to make a difference in public safety. So what are we achieving here? And I'll tell you, if you look at the testimony in committee, what we are doing, not with ill intent. I want to be really clear. I don't think this was done to be mean or with ill intent. But what we are actually doing is placing people at risk who end up being incarcerated in the cells, but we're also forcing a mental health and addiction crisis to go further underground.
So the concern isn't limited to physical harm. There's also a risk of compounding mental health issues.
Yeah, 100%. That's 100%. And there's been lots of studies on long-term mental health impacts of solitary confinement. There's ample research on the long-term impact with it. The other thing, we're potentially harming people's mental health even further. And then they leave the facility after sobering, and there's no place for them to go. So what are we really achieving with that? The other thing, if you look at the testimony that came out of the committee meetings, is that you're putting people that are in drug psychosis in solitary confinement. That's very dangerous to mental health. Locking them up in the midst of a psychosis in these rooms that are with almost like fluorescent bright lights. Now, I have not toured it. My assessment in all fairness, is coming from tours that were posted on media. That is the only time I viewed it. But from what I saw in the media, that is what it looks like. I can't imagine in the middle of a psychosis being placed in solitary confinement under fluorescent lights with a mat on the floor and expect anything good to come out of it.
I really appreciate that perspective. It almost sounds like while these facilities aren't intended to be punitive, they function that way. The provincial government treats people in crisis more like numbers than individuals with rehabilitative needs.
Yeah, the other thing is that it's a jail cell. Like, I've been in jails. It looks no different than a solitary confinement unit. The only difference being that they don't even have a bed. They have a mat. And they haven't figured out safe blankets. It's a solitary confinement unit. That was the observation by Senator Kincaid. It's a jail cell. It's a detention center.
It really comes back to what you said earlier, that this is fundamentally a mental health crisis, not a criminal problem requiring government intervention.
Yeah, it's a mental health problem without enough mental health supports, without enough supports for people who actually want treatment. You also have a right to bodily autonomy. If you're a legislator, we take an oath that we're going to uphold the rule of law. That's the Constitution. We can't then pick and choose when to uphold somebody's rights to bodily autonomy. I mean, that's the reality of it. It's a public health crisis, which means that why aren't we spending the $8 million investing in housing with low barrier housing with wraparound supports? Because you can't demand somebody to stop using narcotics. We know there's so much research that says it doesn't work. So why are we doing it? Why are we spending millions of dollars on solutions that have been researched to death to be totally ineffective? What's the outcome of that? It's getting worse.
Why do you think they're going down this route of not studying the effects of this bill or studying the effects of the program? Because it is going to hurt people, let's be honest. But why are they taking this route that's clearly, on the face of it, it appears unconstitutional, as law students, not running it through strict analysis, but even just looking at it, you know what I mean?
Well, again, I don't think it's bad intention. I'm a legislator, but I'm also in the public eye. And, I understand that there's a lot of concerns about safety. I want to honor that feeling is real, and that there are things like, for example, I have my car on a permanent suburban holiday because I'm tired of getting my windows smashed all the time, right? So I want to honor that. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure on public officials to come up with solutions to make the community safe. I think this was done with that in mind. But the reality is you cannot build healthy communities without the community in mind and everybody in the community. Tough on crime approaches, we know, don't work. Lots of research. I also know that they're an easy political soundbite, in terms of fixing things. We need a major investment in mental health. We need a major investment in low barrier housing with wraparound supports, something that I do hear the provincial government talk about. We can't police our way out of it. We can't foot patrol our way out of this. We need trained professionals that can work with people on the ground, form relationships. And there's all sorts of people doing good things. I think of Nadinaway Mac that does regular outreach, that works directly with people on the ground where they're at, and does that kind of work. We need people that are on the ground, people with experience, whether it's personal or professional, to address the crisis where it's at.
You mentioned earlier the role of political pressure in shaping these responses, and that's something we're seeing in other areas as well, including bail reform. I wanted to turn to a comment from Premier Canoe. He described the facility as replacing what he called a dungeon, referring to the old drunk tank, and said it was designed with input from addictions experts. What's your response to that?
Well, I'm not going to respond to the Premier's intention. I don't think he did this with bad intent. But looking at it, they're solitary confinement units. I currently have a bill that I'm co-sponsoring with Senator Kim Pate on the House side to get rid of, to ban solitary confinement. So I don't want to go after the Premier's intention. What I can say to that is those are solitary confinement units. They're detention cells.
Thank you. That's really helpful. I want to shift a bit to the legal concerns. From your perspective as a legislator, do you think the facility is charter compliant?
Well, it's not charter compliant. You know, I'm not a charter expert, but people have a right to legal counsel.
Right.
For example, when you're detained, you have a right to legal counsel. There is no legal counsel provided here. People have a right to due process. There is no due process here. People also have a right under the Mental Health Act, unless they're a threat to themselves or other, to choose whether they want to receive mental health treatment. We have a Mental Health Act in this country. I mean, there's just so many other things. I mean, people have a right to security and safety under the Charter. When you have medical professionals saying, I'm not sure if somebody's going to die, I'm just unsure how soon it's going to happen, you're not honoring somebody's right to safety and security. So those are a couple of things, as somebody who's not a charter expert, they're obvious to me. The other thing that's really concerning just in this whole trend when you're talking about charter and constitution is this move at all levels of government to take, you spoke about bail, to take away the discretion of judges. There's a reason why there has been a very clear line between the legislative branch and the judiciary. We see this with Bill C-12. I mean, this is a different topic, but it's on the same sort of pattern of legal behavior that we're seeing now, where the minister can interfere in immigration cases. Well, look at what's happening with Trump in the States. Do we want to leave it up to the legislative branch to be able to interfere? We can control who's going to be elected. We might not get the election results we want. Do we want to give that much power to ministers and legislators to be able to interfere in decisions of judges? I argue no. I think that's a dangerous path that we're taking that is becoming far too normalized, that I continue to push back against.
What stands out to me is the lack of due process. In Manitoba, if you're concerned about someone's mental health, there's a formal process. You apply for an assessment, and a judge or judicial justice of the peace must approve any involuntary detention. This facility really seems to bypass that framework entirely.
Yeah, there's a reason why we have a constitution and a charter. There's a reason why as legislators we take an oath of office. You know, I'm an Indigenous person. I had to pledge allegiance to the King. It was not a great experience for me. I'm just being honest, to have to pledge allegiance to my colonizer. I take my oath really seriously. It's difficult because, I was talking to a good friend of mine yesterday who's a human rights lawyer, and I was saying it's really hard because I don't want to cause trouble, but I'm a legislator and I've taken an oath and I'm bound by that oath. And I have to uphold and respect my oath, even if it means standing alone. And it's a lonely time right now, particularly when you're on the side of respecting the Charter and respecting the Constitution.
That's a really important point. It's something we've been discussing a lot in the law school lately. Particularly, there's concerns around democratic backsliding and increasing deference to government decision-making becoming the norm, which is troubling to say the least.
And the other thing, I think, we need to remember that we live in a constitutional democracy and governments are bound by the Constitution. And you know this, you're the law student. So I'm not the law student, but it means that we cannot override the rights in it. Why are we trying to pass legislation that ends up in the courts all the time with charter challenges? How is that effective? I went on a massive push against Bill C-5, which relates to projects of national interest, because I said, like, no projects are going to happen. It's a pipeline to the court. And what do we see now? It's a pipeline to the court. I mean, it's a different topic, but even with this Bill 48, it's a pipeline to the court. But does somebody have to die for us to prove that their charter rights were violated? Is that where we want to go? So I'm deeply, deeply concerned about this 72-hour detention. Why can't we just respect the charter? Why do we have to waste time in the courts? Why can we just not respect the charter? And what concerns me is that it's targeting the most vulnerable people who often are not even aware of what their rights are. And you know this, you're the law students. I'm not the law student, but it means that we cannot override the rights in it. Which is why are we trying to pass legislation that ends up in the courts all the time with charter challenges? How is that effective? I went on a massive push against Bill C-5, which relates to projects of national interest, because I said, like, no projects are going to happen. It's a pipeline to the court. And what do we see now? It's a pipeline to the court. If you look at it's a different topic, but even with this Bill 48, it's a pipeline to the court. But does somebody have to die for us to prove that their charter rights were violated? Is that where we want to go? So I'm deeply, deeply concerned about this 72-hour detention. Why can't we just respect the charter? Why do we have to waste time in the courts? Why can we just not respect the charter? And what concerns me is that it's targeting the most vulnerable people who often are not even aware of what their rights are. So then it becomes incumbent on people like us, who are legislators, to do right, particularly for those who are not even aware what their rights are, to make sure that they are protected and make sure they are safe. Whether it's people who are unhoused, in encampments, or people
I really appreciate that perspective, especially your point about everyone being your constituent. I want to ask about something more practical. There's been concern from medical professionals that short-term detention can increase overdose risk by reducing tolerance. How does that factor into the broader issues with this facility?
Well, what's concerning is that all of these concerns were raised in committee in the study of the bill. So you just have to read through the committee report to know that the increased rates of overdose that will happen, because we know that when you, and I'm certain, again, full disclosure, I'm not a nurse, I'm not a public health expert, but what the facts say is that when people withdraw from narcotics, if they take the same amount after, or if their tolerance is lower, they're more likely to overdose. That's in the committee report. That's not my thought. That's information that was given by public health experts. And I question, as somebody who's not a lawyer, having all of that testimony in committee, if the provincial government is not putting themselves in a very precarious legal position, having all that information on public record and still continuing on with this 72-hour detention center. I question the legal wisdom of that as somebody who's not a lawyer, because they know all of this and they're still proceeding forward. I think it puts the provincial government potentially in a
I'm not sure if you can hear us. I think you cut out for a moment and we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Perfect. Sorry.
Okay, where did I end off? Sorry.
It was about...
I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead, Austin.
I was just saying, you got up to precarious situation, and then it stopped. I think it's also important to talk about the effect of this facility on Indigenous communities. Okay.
Well, it is going to disproportionately impact Indigenous people. I'm pretty sure. But in saying that, one of the things that I've often spoke about is the fact that, first of all, Winnipeg Centre is one of the poorest urban ridings in the country, if not the poorest at some times. And the highest rates of poverty are actually with Indigenous folks. Indigenous folks, many of whom are from Treaty 1 territory, who come to urban centers and are now homeless on their very own lands. Poverty, one of the reasons why I was fighting for a guaranteed livable basic income, is, from my perspective, one of the simplest, most resolvable human rights violations. It's poverty, inflicting people to impoverished circumstances, is a violent human rights violation. Poverty is bad for mental health. Not having proper housing is bad for mental health. Not having food security is bad for mental health. So you're not going to resolve a mental health and poverty crisis through incarceration. You resolve a crisis through a public health response. Housing is a public health response. Mental health supports is a public health response. Providing people with pharmacare so that they can deal with mental health issues by providing them with the proper medication they need to function. For example, people suffering from schizophrenia is a public health response. We are not doing it. And we know the highest rates of poverty are found within the Indigenous community.
Our audience is mostly law students, future lawyers, advocates, and policymakers. What do you want them to take away from this conversation?
I met with a really dear friend of mine yesterday, and I'm not going to name drop, but she's a pretty big name in human rights. And we were just talking about the state of the world and how there's this growing disconnection with our shared humanity. And what I've said many times, and I found out it was actually my grandmother who said it, and I probably picked it up unknowingly, but when you strip people of their humanity, you can justify the most unjustifiable acts. That's true for people that live in poverty. We often objectify people in poverty, and then we start justifying the most unjustifiable acts, like taking away a heater, which is in violation of international human rights law, for people who are houseless, which results in mass amounts of amputations in the houseless community. That's the result of taking away people's humanity to heat. Locking them up in detention centers where there's ample testimony of the risk of that. That's a way of stripping somebody of their rights and humanity. We need to be mindful of our humanity at a time when we're seeing the rise of conflict globally, but also conflict in our community, to always remember that every person has a story. Every person comes from a parent, and that everybody has somebody who knows them, and probably most people have at least one person that loves them unconditionally. And we need to never forget the humanity of others, because that's when things get really bad. And I encourage all legislators at all levels of government to make decisions to put in place legislation that always lifts up the humanity of all people. So I'll leave it at that.
That was Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, speaking with us about Manitoba's 72-hour detention model and its human rights implications.
If you're interested in exploring this further, we'll include links in our show notes to Bill 48, relevant charter provisions, and medical and legal commentary.
This episode is a part of our ongoing work through the Robson Crim Digital Externship, where we aim to bridge legal analysis with real-world impact.
Thanks for listening, and stay tuned for future episodes from the Robson Hall community.